And today's message, if you're like a Bible geek, this will be fun. If not, I don't know. But if you're a Bible geek, you're going to like this. Let me begin with the question. Who killed Jesus? Okay, who killed Jesus and why? Who killed Jesus and why? Let me begin with those questions. Now, we know that it's the Roman soldiers who actually carried out the execution, but we also know that they were following orders. The person who ordered the execution is Pilate, but we also know that he was very conflicted about the decision, and he was almost pressured into doing so. We believe that the people who drove it is actually perhaps the Jewish maybe people, but we know that there are a lot of people among the Hebrews who were fans of Jesus. Some people think that it's the Jewish religious institution or the authorities. Perhaps the Pharisees were driving it, and they had certainly something to do with it. The theological answer is that really no people then killed Jesus, but really our sins, and that is the theological correct answer. But if I'm just asking a more practical question, who drove the agenda to execute Jesus? Now, I have an answer, okay? And when Mark writes, especially about the last week of the life of Jesus, it is extremely clear who drives the agenda to arrest, to try, and execute Jesus. And this is not just a theoretical thing, but I think I have a pretty compelling argument. And there's a group of people who drove that agenda, okay? Mark chapter, and here's a list of verses. Mark chapter 14, verse 1. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. 14:10. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. 14:43. Judas came, one of the 12, with him a crowd in swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. 14:55. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. 15:1. The chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. 15:11. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd and to have him released for them Barabbas instead. 15:31. So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let me ask you this question. Who drove the agenda to arrest, to try, and execute Jesus? Who was it? Chief priests. Mark makes it abundantly clear. The Pharisees aren't even mentioned, according to Mark. Okay? Let me describe to you kind of like the set in which the chief priests belong to. There's all of humanity, right? Jews and Gentiles alike. They're all of God's creation. But among them are the Jews, and God considered them his chosen race. But among the Jews, there were 12 tribes, and one particular tribe were the tribe of Levi, and they're the Levites. And God appointed them to be the religious, the spiritual caretakers of the nation. And if a Jew wanted to be a priest, you could only be a priest if you were a Levite. You cannot be a priest if you were from any of the other 11 tribes. Now, not all the Levites were priests, but priests had to come from the line of Levi. Now, among the priests, there's a special category of priests, and they were the chief priests. They were the leaders of the priests. So they are, and it's the priests who were responsible for the temple, the sacrifice. They were the ones who held the spirituality, the religion of the Jewish people. They were the best of the best, or supposedly they are. They're the religious elites who were supposed to serve as mediators between a sinful man and a holy God, okay? But it is this particular group of people, strangely, who is driving the agenda to arrest, to try, and to execute Jesus. Now, I'm going to do something here for the next 5 minutes or so that I almost never do at Living Hope, publicly or privately. I'm going to talk about politics. Okay? I want to talk about politics because of this. In Acts chapter 5:17, it says, "But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and etc." Acts 5:17 said that the high priest, and this is the way it goes. Now, the nation of Israel were under occupation by the Romans, and so they didn't have freedom, but the Romans gave them self-governance in terms of religion. And in terms of their faith, they had, and just local politics per se, they had different people who were helping to rule. They had a thing called the Sanhedrin, or the Council of the Elders. There's 71 of them, and it was comprised of people from different religious walks, including scribes and things of that nature. The person who headed that up was the high priest. Now, it says this high priest was from the party of the Sadducees. When we look at chapter 15, verse 5, Acts 15:5, we're told that there's a party of the Pharisees. So what we know is this: there are different people with different kind of agendas and thoughts, but there were two major political parties in Israel at that time: the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Okay, so in the Sanhedrin, there were both Pharisees and Sadducees, people of two political parties. Let me describe to you, and if you read the New Testament and you don't quite understand this, you're kind of missing some of the depth of what you're reading. When Paul was arrested in Acts chapter 23, there was a mob that gathered around him. And because Paul was a very politically savvy individual, in Acts chapter 23, verse 6, now when Paul perceived that one part of were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them of. And it's clear from Acts chapter 23, there was two political religious parties. And they sometimes had things in common, sometimes they opposed each other. Okay. Now, let me describe the party of the Pharisees, okay? We'll have the slide up. They were the popularists. And the reason why I say they were the popularists, if you wanted to be a priest, you had to be born as a Levite. But you don't have to be a Levite in order to become a Pharisee, right? And they operated out of synagogues. Synagogues were like churches that existed all over the country and even outside of Israel where Jews gathered. It was like the local church. And what the Pharisees cared about was the law. And they cared a great deal about not only the law, but keeping the law. Part of the thing that motivated the Pharisees is this: they believed that the nation of Israel was under judgment because the people had not obeyed the law. And so they cared a lot about being holy and living according to the law. So if you kind of imagine all the conflicts that Jesus had with the Pharisees, the argument oftentimes revolved around, hey, how come you're healing on the Sabbath? How come you're not tithing? How come your people aren't fasting? How come you're hanging out with sinners and tax collectors? The Pharisees were accusing Jesus and his disciples of not keeping the law. They believed that cooperating with the Romans was unholy, and they abhorred the Romans. They were theologically more conservative. They believed in the resurrection, the afterlife, and they not only believed in the Old Testament, but they formed oral traditions. So they kind of added to it. You can't just, don't get drunk, but don't even drink a NyQuil. That kind of thing, right? Paul was a Pharisee. Nicodemus from John chapter 3 was a Pharisee. Now, Jesus, if you know your Bible a little bit or geography, lived most of his life in northern Israel or the region of Galilee. And so if you think with me, in Galilee, there were synagogues, but not the temple. So a lot of the run-ins that Jesus would have would be with the Pharisees. If there was a pitfall in this particular party, it was because the Pharisees believed that the nation of Israel was being judged because they were not keeping the law. And so they themselves were trying so hard to keep the law, tithing the mint leaves that they grew in their backyard, washing their hands ceremoniously, staying away from people whom they believed were unclean, etc., etc. And they looked at other people who weren't doing that with contempt and with judgment, and they themselves had a sense of holiness and pride. Okay? And so you think about all the New Testament or the gospel stories, and it kind of started making sense, right? Now, here's the other party. The other party is the party of the Sadducees. Now, this was the more elite party. They were the upper class, and partially it's because you could only be a priest if you were born into the Levitical lineage. So people couldn't strive to be a Levite. It was kind of you were born into it like an upper class. And the other reason why this is considered more the elite party is this. Now, when the Romans came, they said, you can't have a standing army. We're not going to give you freedom, but the one area we're going to give you freedom in is in your practice of religion. Okay? So you can have your temple, and you can offer sacrifices, etc. But when it comes to appointing the high priest, like the Pope, we have to approve whom you appoint as high priest. Does that make sense? And so, when the Jewish people were choosing who could be high priest or like the Pope of their country, it had to be someone who can work with the Romans. And so it would be someone who was okay with them, and once they got hold of that power and position, and they had control over the temple, who comes in to give offering, etc., what they would do is leverage that position for personal gain. It was an immensely powerful position to be in. If the place where the Pharisees operated out of were the synagogues, the Sadducees or the party of the priests operated out of the temple. It's more centralized in Jerusalem. They held the gate to the Jewish religion. The Jews believed that if you wanted to be forgiven for your sins, you don't simply go into your room and say, Lord, will you forgive me? You had to take an animal, go to the temple in the Day of Atonement or whatever, offer a sacrifice, and the way that you offer sacrifice, you have to give it to the priest. Who controlled that? It's the Sadducees. So it was the elite. It was a hierarchical thing. They were more accommodating to the Roman government, like I said. They were more theologically liberal. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the afterlife. If you recall the argument that the religious leaders often had with Jesus, one of the arguments goes like this. The Sadducees came to Jesus and say, well, you believe in the resurrection, that they don't. What happens if someone is married, loses a spouse, and they're married again, and they lose another spouse, etc., 7 times, and they go to your so-called afterlife or heaven? Who's their spouse? Right? And that's the Sadducees trying to manipulate an argument. Okay? What is kind of different about the Sadducees as compared to the Pharisees was this: the Pharisees abhorred the status quo. They believed that they cannot be under Roman rule. They were really unhappy. The Sadducees, although they weren't like thrilled about the Romans, they've achieved elite status at this particular point. And so they didn't want to do anything that would rock the boat. They wanted status quo. And what if there was a word that kind of describe what they were motivated by. They held on to power, and they wanted to keep it. Okay? If you read through the Gospels, this is what would happen. When Jesus was in Galilee or northern Israel, he would battle the Pharisees. But in the last week, so he would periodically come down to Jerusalem. But when his last week of his life, when he came to Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, etc., he starts battling the Sadducees or the chief priests. Because now it's in Jerusalem. And remember, one of the first things that Jesus did when he came into Jerusalem, he goes into the temple, overturns the money changers and things of that nature. He's offending not the Pharisees, he's offending the Sadducees or the priests. So now they're up in arms. Okay, having said all that, now, the Sadducees is the party of the priests. The people who kind of controlled all of that were the chief priests. And it's the chief priests, and this is my argument, it's the chief priests who were responsible for arresting, trying, and executing Jesus. And in Mark chapter 14, 15, I believe this is abundantly clear. All right? We're going to look at 3 scenes and go to the 4th one. The first scene is chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. And all the passages will be up on the screen, I believe. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Now, it's clear that there is an agenda by the high priest. They weren't simply wanting to arrest Jesus and keep him in jail for years. They wanted to arrest him in order to execute him. It wasn't because Jesus was an immensely unpopular figure in Israel. In fact, they were worried because he was too popular. So they were trying to figure out a way, and this is the elite people who were in charge. How do we remove this popular religious figure whom the common people think is their Messiah? Now, their opportunity came in chapter 14, verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests. Notice, Judas goes not to the Pharisees, but he goes to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. And the opportunity in which they seize is when Jesus is at the Garden of Gethsemane. It was night. There wasn't a big crowd. Jesus only took 3 of his disciples there, and they were praying. And Judas came because he knew that they were there with the soldiers. Now, in chapter 14, verse 43, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, with a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and elders. John says the crowd consisted of soldiers and officers. Now, the Jews did not have a standing army. Okay? They were under occupation of the Romans. But the group that still had like guards and soldiers were in the temple. They had temple guards because they had control over their religious affairs. And it's the chief priests who controlled that. So the chief priests brought temple guards to arrest Jesus. Now, let's go to the second scene, the trial of Jesus. Jesus is brought now to the high priest. Remember, he was like the pope of the Sanhedrin or the council of the elders. He was the party of the Sadducees. His name is probably Caiaphas. And in this particular era, there was Caiaphas and Annas, and they were like, one was like emeritus, but Caiaphas is the one that we'll kind of be introduced to. And in verse 53, and they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together, and Peter had followed him from a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. Verse 55, and this is where it gets interesting. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Now this is interesting. The council didn't seek to try to find out truth. Jesus was on trial, but they had a purpose, they had a final end, and what they wanted to do was find him guilty of an executable crime. Does that make sense? They weren't trying to find out who he is, what he said, what he did. What can we do to justify us executing Jesus? This is the problem, though. Jesus was the only person to ever have lived on earth who never sinned. That's a terrible person to try to prosecute, right? He was literally a sinless individual. Now, Jesus had offended the religious leaders quite a bit. He called the Pharisees, a bunch of hypocrites and things like that. That's not necessarily a crime. He came into the temple and he overturned the crooks who were exchanging Roman coins for temple coins and things of that nature. But if the Sadducees or the chief priests start accusing Jesus of that, they would implicate themselves. That's the problem. And so they even got people to give false testimonies, and some people came in and said, oh yeah, I heard Jesus say one time he's going to destroy the temple. But Jesus was talking figuratively, and they realized there was really no basis for that charge. They were looking for a crime that would convict him of a crime that was executable. They couldn't find any. So verse 16, instead of asking, what did he do? What did you do? The chief priest, or the high priest, Caiaphas, asks this very perceptive question. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Instead of asking, what did you do? He's asking, who are you? Are you the Christ? Are you claiming yourself to be equal with God? To which Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus basically said, I am. I am divine. To which, verse 63, the high priest tore his garment. This is the Jewish way of expressing immense anger or anguish. What further witness do we need? We don't have to follow judicial protocol anymore. As Pope, I'm just going to make a decision. Everyone follow. You have heard his blasphemy. What is their decision? They all condemned him as deserving death. Now, it's clear. I want to make it clear. The Sanhedrin or the chief priests, they do not have authority to sentence someone to death. All they can do was say he's deserving of death in their in their religious sense. Does that make sense? And they make that a determination right there and then. Now the question that we should ask is, why did the chief priests get so angry? What drove them to the point where they're just, and then we find out that they're spitting on him, hitting him, and things of that nature? Was it because that they cared so much about the holiness of God that when someone blasphemed in that way, they became angry, protecting the holiness of God? And some may argue that that's exactly what they were doing, but I don't know. I'm kind of going to argue that it's not because that they were guarding the holiness of God, but rather they were trying to guard some darkness in their heart. Sometimes the reason why Christians even get angry at the sins of the world or darkness of culture or sins of other people, I'm going to say this, the reason why you and I sometimes get so upset when we see sin in our culture and there's these pet peeve sins is not necessarily because we care so much about the holiness of God, but it's because we're trying to hide and compensate for sin in our own heart. Let me try to argue my case. No one is perfect, but the church has often been found with hypocritical scandals. I can't tell you the number of Christian leaders just within the last 10 years or so even that have written, spoken, consulted, organized, have become a spokespeople for certain issues, good issues, on things like purity, integrity, homosexuality, grace, the gospel, and things of that nature, only to find out some years later that they were guilty, found out of those exact same things. I was kind of preparing this particular section, and I was recalling different Christian leaders, and I just kind of started to become really discouraged of leaders who spoke out against certain things only to have been accused of abusing drugs and visiting male prostitutes, and strong denial, only to later, oh yeah, well maybe that's partially true. I'm not going to name this leader, but this one particular leader, well known, pretty famous. He sat on some boards, Christian boards that we find very respectable, that we follow, and wrote a bunch of books. Was pastor to a mega church. I wrote a lot of books on things like grace, love, suffering. He was accused of having an extramarital affair, denied it. Eventually, it became evident that it was true. His denomination had to come in and say, you're no longer fit for ministry. He just didn't, the denomination had to kind of come down on him. But because he was such an intensely gifted individual, he got a job not too long after that at another large megachurch. He started an organization which focused on restoration and integrity and how God can heal the broken and such. And we thought that this perhaps was a great second chance story. Until not too long after he started his job at the new mega church, church that you all know, and his organization, it was found that he had a second extramarital affair. You know, it's as I was thinking about all this, I had this gnawing feeling that I wonder if the reason why we get so passionate about certain issue is not because we desire to keep and guard the glory of God, but really it's to compensate for the darkness in our hearts. And if that's the case, church, if we find ourselves getting angry at the sins of others more than we get angry at the sins that lie in our own hearts, I think we need to be careful. And I think when the high priest tore his clothes, oh, blasphemy, I wonder if he really cared about the holiness of God, but he was hiding, compensating, trying to show, look, I'm so holy, look what I've done. Let's go to the third scene. It's the sentencing. The problem with the high chief priests is they did not, like I said, have the authority to actually sentence anyone to death. And so in chapter 15, verse 1, as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. Pilate was the Gentile governor to this area. Pilate had the authority to sentence someone to death. Okay? So they send him to him. And Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And that was the charge. See, the chief priests were looking for a crime in which they can charge Jesus that would cause him to be executed. And if Jesus is claiming to be a political king, they can accuse him of treason, trying to overthrow the Roman government. So that's what they were trying to do. He's calling himself the king of the Jews. Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And in other parts, he says, I'm the king of, not of this world, but... And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate asked him again, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. You're not giving yourself any kind of defense. Verse 6. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked, and this is apparently some sort of a tradition. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" Now, Pilate is now calling Jesus the King of the Jews. And this is key, chapter 15, verse 10. Now, we began with the question, who killed Jesus and why? And I've made it clear that I think the group of people that drove the arrest and the trial and the execution of Jesus is the chief priests. And I think this is why. For Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. This neutral governor, non-Jewish governor, looked at what was going on, and he could plainly see that the chief priests were driven by jealousy, envy. But it says in verse 11, the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call King of the Jews?" And this is kind of an irony. They're charging him of being the King of the Jews, and he's saying, well, okay, I'm going to call him the King of the Jews. And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" And they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So historically, I want you to understand that Pilate delivered Jesus to be crucified, but not because he found him guilty, but simply out of political expediency, because of the pressure that was put on him by the chief priests. Let's go to the fourth. Oh no, hold on. What's interesting is the chief priests are supposed to be the best people. They're the ones who should have been waiting for the Messiah all the more. They should have been the ones who should have questioned Jesus to see if he's fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. They should have been the one examining his works and seeing if it was valid or not. They should have been the ones who would open their arms and saying, "God, is this your promised son?" But it was evident that from the beginning they had an agenda. And their agenda was to kill Jesus. Not arrest him, not to keep him in jail, but to kill Jesus. And I think Pilate correctly observed that the reason why they were so single-mindedly intent on the death of Jesus is the jealousy that was in their heart. Now, I brought us to this point after having told you about the two parties. Okay? You remember the two parties now, right? The Pharisees who wanted change from the status quo. And they didn't like Jesus either because they believed that he was he wasn't keeping the law and certain things, and their pride got in the way. But remember the Sadducees? What did they care about? The status quo, and what did they have? Power. And the Sadducees, or the chief priests, saw Jesus, who healed, who did miracles, who taught in a way like they've never seen. They were supposed to be the gateway to forgiveness. They had positions of power and privilege and money. And Jesus can give forgiveness without them? It threatened their whole existence. Maybe there was a small part of them that thought maybe Jesus is whom he says he claims to be, but I don't want to believe that. And out of envy and out of jealousy, they said no. In 1517, Martin Luther began the Protestant Reformation. And a lot of us understand that the Protestant Reformation began when he nailed the 95 Theses on the door, and he began this new theology, or like a rediscovery of sola fide, salvation by faith only and not by works. What people kind of don't know is that thing that really drove Martin Luther to fight against the church is not necessarily sola fide, but it's a thing called indulgences. Indulgences is this. The Catholic Church at that time believed that when you die, you don't necessarily just automatically go to heaven, even Christians, but you go to a holding place before you go to heaven. And in that holding place, you pay off the penalty of the remnant of your sins. And then you go. This purgatory place. So there's a lot of suffering up there. And so what the Catholic Church has devised is that instead of suffering in purgatory, you can do advance payments by giving money to the church, indulgences, so that you can kind of skip purgatory altogether and go straight to heaven. What a great idea, right? And you can kind of see the corruption there. And the Catholic Church and the priests say, well, if you want to go directly to heaven and bypass purgatory, $1 million for our new capital campaign for a building. We're going to build a parsonage for the priests. And it was rampant corruption, and that's what drove Martin Luther so much. What was it that the chief priests held onto that caused them to want Jesus removed? They had this position of power, and they said, I don't want anyone to remove that. There's a fourth act. It's not only the trial, not only the arrest, the trial, and the execution, but there's a burial. What is strange is this. The people who buried the body of Jesus were not his friends. They were all afraid. They scattered. Peter denied. But it says in chapter 15, verse 42, when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, you think that the famous Joseph in the Bible, or Joseph from the Old Testament, or Joseph, the father of Jesus, but this is another Joseph who was really an important figure. He was a respected member of the council. He sat in that seat, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. We're told, according to Luke, that he did not agree with the council when the judgment was passed, but we're also told in John chapter 19 that he kept quiet because he feared. But now he comes in boldness. We're also told that Nicodemus, who was the secret disciple that Jesus talked to in John chapter 3, came out too. And the two of them asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, took him to Joseph Arimathea's tomb, a carved out, a solid piece of stone carved out tomb, and placed the body of Jesus there. We're not told a lot more, but I would like to think that after the stone was rolled on the front of the entrance of the tomb, that later on, a few days later, Joseph of Arimathea hears that Jesus has risen again. And he goes to his own personal tomb that he gave to Jesus, and the body's not there. And for 40 days, Jesus is ministering, and Joseph of Arimathea sees and hears Jesus again. What caused the chief priests, who should have known better, to reject Jesus? And perhaps the reason they rejected Jesus, were so intent on killing Jesus, is because they wanted to keep what they had. They thought that power, the money, the prestige, that's it. What was different about Joseph of Arimathea? It says in verse 43, he was looking for the kingdom of God. he realized that their power, their riches, that wasn't enough. That this world that was filled with viruses and cancer and crime, that it has to be something else. That he knew that governments and formal religion didn't have the answer. That God will send the Messiah, and that perhaps Jesus is he. And then when Jesus rose again from the dead, I believe Joseph and Arimathea realized this is him who we had been waiting for. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me?